I thought my parents were divorced, but they had been faking it for 20 years to get college aid for us. I, 32M, never thought I'd be sitting here, writing this story, but here I am. It feels like my life has just been thrown into the air, and now I'm trying to make sense of the pieces that are falling around me. It started last week, when I was at my mom's house, going through some old family photos with my younger brother. You know, the kind of thing you do when you're cleaning out the attic, trying to find some old memories that you can reminisce about. I was flipping through the album when I came across a picture of my parents at their 20th wedding anniversary. They looked so happy, so in love. My mom was wearing this beautiful blue dress that she still talks about, and my dad was all smiles, his arm around her waist. The photo seemed perfect until I started to think back to something my brother had mentioned to me a few years ago when we were both in college. You see, during our time in school, our parents had always acted distant, almost like roommates rather than a married couple. We never really questioned it, at least not out loud. But every once in a while, my brother would joke about how our parents acted like they were divorced, how they barely spoke to each other, didn't share a bed, and always seemed to go off in separate directions. But no one really addressed it. It was just how things were, right? Parents fight, they fall out of love, and that's life. Then, there was the financial aid situation. My brother and I both managed to get great scholarships, but there was always this unspoken advantage we had. My parents' financial situation seemed to be precarious enough to help us get aid, but they never really had any major struggles that I could see. I thought that was just part of the struggling middle class thing everyone talked about. But now, as I was looking at this photo of my parents together, something clicked. After some quick searching through old emails and financial documents, I found something that made my stomach drop. I found a paper trail of financial aid applications, all filled out under the assumption that my parents were separated, divorced, and living in different households. They had been telling this lie for years, and I had never noticed it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I needed to confront them. But how do you ask your parents something like that? How do you ask them, "Hey, have you been pretending to be divorced for 2 decades?" I had no idea how to approach it. But, at the same time, I had no choice. Something was off, and I needed answers. I needed to understand what they'd been hiding and why. That night, after we finished going through the boxes of old stuff, I decided to ask my mom about it. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking tea. She had a look on her face, the one that made it clear she was thinking about something else, probably trying to avoid whatever was coming next. I sat down across from her, my hands sweating slightly. I tried to start casually, but there was no way to ease into it. "Mom, I need to ask you something. I found some financial documents from when we were applying for college aid, and it looks like you and Dad, you were listed as separated." Her eyes widened just a little, and I could tell that she was holding something back. She cleared her throat before answering, her voice soft but firm. "That's not something I've ever talked about with you," she said, her tone almost defensive. I didn't want to push her too hard, but I couldn't let it go either. "Why did you and Dad do that? Was there a reason?" My mom's gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she sighed, the weight of whatever she was about to say heavy in the air. "Sit back. This is a long story." I sat back in my chair, feeling a tight knot in my stomach. I wasn't ready for whatever she was about to drop on me. But it didn't matter. I needed to hear it. "You remember how your father and I always seemed to be at odds, right?" she asked, looking up at me, her eyes narrowing. I nodded slowly. That much was obvious. "Well, we never meant for it to be like that. When we first got married, we were in love, but life changes. People change. The thing is, we never really talked about the toll it was taking on our relationship. But we also knew that we couldn't get divorced, at least not on paper. It would hurt you and your brother." I stared at her, trying to wrap my mind around what she was saying. "So you didn't get divorced?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "We never did. But we made it look like we did." My heart skipped a beat. "Why? Why would you do that?" My mom leaned forward, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "We did it to help you too with your education. The financial aid system is messed up, and we knew that if we were separated on paper, you'd get better grants and scholarships. It was all about getting you both the education you deserved without putting us in debt for the rest of our lives." I couldn't speak for a moment. This wasn't what I expected. Not by a long shot. I had always assumed that their financial issues were just part of the game. But this was a whole new level of deception. So all these years, I trailed off, trying to process it. "You and Dad. What? You just pretended to be separated?" She nodded slowly. "We lived our lives separately when we could. He stayed out late at work or went on trips for business. I had my own things. But at the end of the day, we came back to the same house, and we acted like everything was fine. For you and your brother. That's all we ever wanted." It felt like the floor was slipping out from under me. I couldn't understand how they had been able to pull this off for so long. How did they keep it a secret for all these years? How did we never see it? Before I could say anything else, my mom raised a hand, signaling me to hold on. You need to talk to your father about this. I'm not the only one involved, and I'm not the one who holds all the answers. And just like that, I was left with more questions than answers. I stood up to leave, the conversation hanging heavy in the air between us. I had to talk to my dad, but the thought of confronting him about this, I wasn't sure I was ready. But there was no turning back now. I had to find out everything. I needed to know if this was really the full story, or if there was more to uncover. I left my mom's house in a daze, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. My brother had been at college when all of this happened, but I knew I had to tell him what I'd learned. He deserved to know the truth. The truth about our family, about the secrets that had been hidden from us for years. I called him on my way home. His voice, groggy from a late-night study session, cracked through the phone. Hey, what's up? I hesitated before speaking. We need to talk. About what? He asked, his tone still sleepy. I just found out something about Mom and Dad. Something big. I could hear my brother sit up straighter on the other end of the phone. What? What's going on? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves before diving in. Remember how you always joked that Mom and Dad acted like they were divorced? Well, turns out, they were pretending to be. They've been faking their divorce for 20 years. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him processing the words in real time. Then he muttered, "Wait, what?" I repeated myself, but this time, I added more details about the financial aid forms I'd found, the emails, and how my mom had confirmed everything. He didn't speak for a while, and I could tell he was trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, he said, "So they've been living a lie? All this time?" "Yeah. They made it look like they were separated so we could get more financial aid for college." I replied, trying to make sense of it all myself. "And I guess it worked, because you and I both got those scholarships, didn't we? But that means all this time they've been living separate lives, just pretending for our sake." "You've got to be kidding me." He let out a frustrated sigh. I never thought they'd actually do something like this. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, the shock that mirrored my own. This wasn't something anyone would expect from their parents. It didn't seem real. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. It was like this whole hidden world had been right under our noses. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I have to talk to Dad. He's part of this too. I need answers from both of them," I said. "I can't just leave it like this. They've lied to us, and we have the right to know why." "I agree," my brother said after a beat. "I'm coming home for the weekend. We can talk to them together." "All right," I agreed. "I'll let you know when I talk to Dad." I hung up, the weight of the situation only growing heavier. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that they had lied to us for so long or the fact that they'd done it so we could have a better shot at college. It was hard to process. Were they doing it out of love for us? Or had they been hiding behind the lie for so long that they didn't even know how to come clean anymore? The next day, I went to my dad's house, the place I'd grown up in. The house still smelled the same, like old wood and faint traces of pipe smoke. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but it always felt like home. Until now. Now, the air felt thick with tension, like a dam about to burst. I rang the doorbell and waited. When my dad opened the door, I saw the familiar graying hair, the tired eyes, the slight slouch from years of working long hours. Nothing about him seemed out of the ordinary, but I knew things weren't what they seemed. "Hey, kid," he said with a half-smile, stepping aside to let me in. I nodded, keeping my distance. I sat down on the couch, my stomach churning as I tried to figure out how to start. There was no easy way into this conversation, no good way to break the news. "Dad, I need to ask you something," I began. His eyes flicked to mine, sensing that something was off. "Sure, what's up?" I took a deep breath. "Mom told me everything." He raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering. "Everything about what?" "About the divorce," I said, watching his face closely. "Or, should I say, about the fact that you two were never really divorced." His eyes went cold, his posture stiffening. "What are you talking about?" I tried to keep my voice calm, despite the rapid pulse in my throat. "For years, you and Mom have been pretending to be separated so that we could get more financial aid for college. You've been lying to us. To everyone." "What?" The silence that followed felt suffocating. My dad didn't respond at first, his jaw tightening as he looked away. I could see the guilt creeping into his expression, but he didn't say anything for a long time. It was like he was weighing whether to admit everything or keep the charade going. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Your mother was right. We did it for you and your brother. We didn't want you two to struggle like we did growing up. We thought we could keep it going until you both got through college, and then it would be over. No one would be any the wiser." I stared at him, stunned. "But you've been living separate lives all these years. How could you keep that up? How could you pretend?" "Because we didn't want to burden you with the truth," he said, his voice more defensive now. We didn't want you two to know that we were struggling with money. We didn't want you to feel like you had to make sacrifices just to get a degree. The system's broken, kid. It's all about appearances, and we were just trying to play the game." I shook my head. "That doesn't make it right, Dad. You can't just live a lie like that. We had a right to know. You and Mom could have been honest with us." He ran a hand through his hair, looking tired. "I didn't know how to tell you. We thought we were doing the right thing, and now it's all falling apart." I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand that he explain everything in more detail. But another part of me understood. He had tried to do what he thought was best. Even if it was all built on a lie, it wasn't because he didn't love us. It was because he didn't know any better. "Are you planning to tell Mom?" I asked after a long pause. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time. But I'm not sure she's ready to face the consequences of all this." I didn't know what I was expecting from this conversation, but this wasn't it. My dad wasn't justifying it. He was admitting to it, trying to explain why they'd done it, even though it didn't make any of it right. "So what now?" I asked, the uncertainty in my voice clear. He looked at me for a moment, then sighed deeply. "I guess we deal with it, son. Whatever happens, we have to face it. All of us." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one I was going to get. I didn't know where to go from here. How do you move forward when the foundation you've built your entire life on turns out to be a lie? The rest of that conversation with my dad felt like a blur. We sat there for what felt like hours, talking in circles, but never really getting anywhere. He apologized. I got angry. We both fell silent. It was clear that my father and mother had built this complicated system for years, a web of half-truths, all meant to keep us from the hard reality. But now, with it all exposed, there was no denying the damage done. When I finally left his house, I was drained, empty. I didn't feel any closer to understanding the bigger picture. I wanted answers, but all I had was more confusion. I needed to talk to my brother, needed to hear what he thought, what he was feeling. Later that week, he came home for the weekend, just like he said he would. He had a heavy look on his face when he walked in the door, like he knew the gravity of what we were about to face. "I talked to Mom," he said, his voice lower than usual. "She's just, I don't know, man. She's not as sorry as Dad is. She keeps saying she did it for us, that we would have been buried in debt without it." But he trailed off, shaking his head. "It feels like they didn't trust us enough to know the truth." I nodded, still processing everything I had learned. "Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with. I understand the whole college thing, the need for financial aid, but I don't know. It feels like they kept us in the dark on purpose." "We were kids," my brother said, the bitterness clear in his voice. "They treated us like we were too young to handle the truth. They thought we couldn't handle reality, but I think we would have rather known." It was hard to argue with that. Growing up, I'd never questioned the odd way our parents lived. Sure, they had their disagreements, their distance, but it was always just normal to us. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The cold silences during family meals, the way Dad always had to go on business trips, right when we'd expect a family vacation. But we never put it together. Now, with the pieces falling into place, it all seemed so obvious. The question was, why did they think lying would be the better choice? We spent the next few hours discussing what to do. Should we confront them together? Should we leave things as they were? I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over us. The truth was that nothing would be the same again. There would be no pretending, no glossing over it. This family had been built on secrets, and those secrets were now out in the open. It wasn't just a matter of forgiving them. It was a matter of figuring out who we were now, as a family, after all the masks had come off. Eventually, we decided that it was time to confront both of them. We couldn't let this linger any longer. We needed to know everything, and we deserved to hear it directly from them. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. That evening, we sat them both down in the living room. It felt like a court hearing, the tension in the air so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mom sat across from us, her arms crossed, and my dad was beside her, his face unreadable. My brother and I exchanged a quick glance before diving in. "Mom, Dad," I began, "we need to understand everything. We need to know why this started and how you thought it was okay to hide it from us." My mom looked away, avoiding eye contact as usual. My dad, on the other hand, met my gaze directly. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he sighed, the weight of it all catching up with him. "We didn't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice low. "We were trying to protect you. The financial aid system is messed up, and we wanted you both to have opportunities that we didn't. But I see now that it wasn't the right choice." My mom finally spoke, her voice soft but defensive. "We did it out of love. You both worked so hard, and we didn't want money to be the reason you didn't succeed. If we told you the truth, you might have felt guilty or worried about us. And that wasn't fair to you." My brother's voice cut through the tension. "But we had a right to know. We're not kids anymore. You don't get to make those decisions for us." There was a long silence as my parents exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. I could see the regret in their eyes now, the realization that their well-intentioned deception had come at a cost. My mom, who had always been the one to keep the family together, now looked smaller, fragile, like she had just realized the full weight of what she had done. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "We should have told you sooner. We thought we were doing the right thing, but now I see how much we hurt you both. We just wanted you to have a better life than we did." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to be angry, to tell them how much they'd screwed up, but I could see the pain in their faces. They had done what they thought was best, even if it was all wrong. And while I wasn't ready to forgive them completely, I knew they were still my parents. They hadn't meant to harm us. They just didn't know any better. "Why didn't you just talk to us?" my brother asked, his voice quieter now. "Why keep this secret? We're not kids anymore. You could have trusted us." My dad swallowed hard before answering, his voice hoarse. I didn't know how. It felt like we were already too far into it. I thought it would just be easier to keep pretending. My mom nodded in agreement, tears welling up in her eyes. I thought I could fix it, that it would all just work itself out. But I see now that it didn't. And I'm sorry for that. There it was, the apology we had been waiting for. The one thing that had been missing for so long, accountability. They didn't try to justify it anymore. They just admitted it. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything sinking in. It wasn't easy to digest, but it felt like the beginning of something. Maybe not a full healing, not yet, but at least the truth had been laid bare. "I guess we move forward now," I said finally, the words strange but true. "Yeah," my brother added, looking at our parents. We moved forward. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was enough. The truth had been exposed, and now it was up to us to figure out what came next. We didn't need to have all the answers right away, but we did need to take the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. Maybe it wasn't going to be perfect. Maybe things would never go back to the way they were. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally facing reality, together. And that, for now, was enough.